February 16th, 1940. Jussingfjord, a narrow, steep-sided inlet on the southwestern coast of neutral Norway, barely a mile and a half long. A British destroyer, ordered into these waters against the express wishes of the Norwegian government, closes on a German tanker wedged against the rocks after running aground while trying to escape. Two Norwegian gunboats sit between them, their torpedo tubes trained on the British ship under orders not to allow a boarding. Below the tanker's deck, hidden in the empty oil tanks of her hold, 299 British merchant sailors have spent weeks locked in darkness, prisoners of the German Navy, with no idea rescue is even being attempted. In the next 20 minutes, a boarding party will storm across in the last major hand-to-hand action fought by the Royal Navy, using rifles, bayonets, and in one case, an actual cutlass. 4 words, shouted down into a ship's hold, will become one of the most famous lines of the entire war. This is the story of HMS Cossack and the Altmark incident. To understand why 299 British sailors were locked in a German tanker's hold off the coast of Norway, you have to go back 3 months. To the South Atlantic and the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee. Through the autumn of 1939, Graf Spee had sunk 9 Allied merchant ships on a single raiding cruise, and rather than leave survivors adrift, her captain had transferred captured crews onto his supply ship, the tanker Altmark, to keep his own raiding operation unencumbered by prisoners. When Graf Spee herself was cornered and eventually scuttled off Montevideo in December 1939, Altmark was left to make her own way home to Germany, still carrying almost 300 British merchant seamen locked below decks. Now the last physical evidence of the raiders' entire campaign, and a live diplomatic problem for whoever found her first. By February 1940, Altmark was creeping up the Norwegian coast, using neutral territorial waters as a corridor to avoid the Royal Navy entirely, on the understanding that a supposedly unarmed merchant tanker carrying no military cargo was entitled to safe passage under international law. Norwegian officials boarded and inspected her at least once and reported finding nothing and no prisoners, either because the search was cursory or because the prisoners were successfully hidden during it. The problem facing the British government was not military. It was legal and diplomatic, and by most conventional thinking, close to unsolvable. Norway was neutral, adamant about staying that way, and had already told the Royal Navy that Altmark was a civilian vessel under Norwegian protection, not a legitimate target. Boarding a foreign ship inside another country's territorial waters without permission was, under normal circumstances, precisely the kind of act that dragged neutral countries into wars they were desperately trying to avoid. And Britain, in February 1940, badly needed Scandinavian neutrality to hold, not collapse. 2 Royal Navy destroyers, Ivanhoe and Intrepid, had already tried to intercept Altmark earlier the same day, and failed, driven off by her Norwegian escorts before she slipped into the fjord to hide. By any reasonable diplomatic calculation, the operation should have ended there, with an apologetic acknowledgement that a neutral nation's waters were, in fact, neutral, and 299 men would spend the rest of the war as German prisoners. What changed the calculation was a decision made not by anyone aboard a ship, but by the First Lord of the Admiralty in London. Winston Churchill personally authorized Captain Philip Vian, commanding the destroyer HMS Cossack, to enter Norwegian territorial waters and, if the Norwegians would not cooperate in a joint search, to board Altmark by force, regardless of Norwegian objections, using no more violence than necessary if the Norwegian escorts themselves opened fire. It was an extraordinary order, a conscious decision to treat a moral and human argument, that British prisoners of war should not simply vanish into Germany because of a technicality of maritime law, as more important than the diplomatic risk of violating a neutral country's sovereignty outright. The hidden advantage the British actually possessed in this story was not a weapon or a piece of engineering. It was political will at the very top, combined with a captain willing to execute an order that could have ended his career or started a much larger diplomatic crisis if it had gone wrong. Vian first tried the diplomatic route, entering the fjord and requesting a joint Anglo-Norwegian escort of Altmark to Bergen, where a proper search could be carried out under both flags. The Norwegian commander on the scene refused, repeating that Altmark carried no prisoners, had already been inspected, and was entitled to pass. Vian withdrew to consult London by radio. Churchill's answer came back within hours. If the Norwegians would not cooperate, board the vessel anyway. Shortly after 8 in the evening, Cossack re-entered the fjord. In a small detail historians still find almost comic given what followed. Cossack's navigator had actually lost his bearings in the dark and asked for the ship's lights to be switched on simply to see where the rocks were, inadvertently signaling exactly where the British destroyer was to everyone watching from shore. Cossack slipped between the two Norwegian torpedo boats, which had orders not to fire, and closed on Altmark directly. If you found this look at how a single order from London turned a diplomatic dead end into a rescue interesting, subscribing helps the channel keep telling these stories. Altmark's captain, Heinrich Dow, reacted to the approaching British destroyer by ordering full speed astern, apparently attempting to either escape deeper into the fjord or ram Cossack outright. In the confusion, Altmark ran hard aground on the rocks, ending her own escape attempt more effectively than anything the British had managed to do to her. Dow's crew hurled the ship's confidential papers overboard to keep them out of British hands, but Dow himself, reportedly concerned about the prisoners locked below, chose not to trigger the scuffling charges that would have flooded the hold. Cossack maneuvered alongside, used grappling irons to lash the two ships together, and Vian gave the order "away boarders." A party of roughly 3 officers and 30 ratings, armed mostly with rifles and fixed bayonets, and by most accounts a single cutlass carried by one of the officers, went across onto Altmark's deck in the dark. What happened next lasted only a few minutes, but turned violent almost immediately. Accounts differ on exactly who fired first, but hand-to-hand fighting broke out across several parts of the ship, and the boarding party quickly gained the upper hand. Most historical accounts put German losses at somewhere between 6 and 8 sailors killed, and around 10 to 12 wounded, several of them shot while trying to flee across the ice toward shore. The only British casualty of the entire action was Warrant Officer J.J.F. Smith, wounded by a booby trap, who was treated afterward by Altmark's own ship's surgeon and survived. Having secured the bridge and the upper decks, the boarding party moved to the holds, where the prisoners had been sealed in the ship's empty oil tanks for weeks. A sailor threw open a hatch and shouted down into the darkness, asking if there were any Englishmen below. When a chorus of voices shouted back that they were all British, the reply came back, delivered almost casually given the stakes. "Well, the Navy's here," it set off cheering that could reportedly be heard across the deck. All 299 men were brought up and transferred across to Cossack that same night, while Altmark's surviving crew were, notably, left aboard their own grounded ship rather than taken prisoner, and no attempt was made to disable her any further before Cossack withdrew from the fjord shortly after midnight. Cossack reached the port of Leith in Scotland on the afternoon of the 17th of February to public celebration, landing all 299 rescued merchant seamen to a country desperate for good news during the tense, largely static early months of the war that British newspapers were already calling the phony war. Vian was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for the action, and the phrase shouted down into Altmark's hold, "The Navy's here," entered the language almost immediately as a popular rallying cry that would be repeated throughout the rest of the conflict. For the Royal Navy specifically, the boarding stood as the last time in its history that a British warship's crew took an enemy vessel in a close-quarters fight with bayonets and cutlasses. A genuinely old-fashioned action fought in the same year Germany was building magnetic mines and preparing armored blitzkrieg columns for the invasion of France. The diplomatic fallout was exactly as serious as the original calculation had warned it might be. Norway lodged formal protests through diplomatic channels over the violation of its neutral waters, and while no Norwegian military action followed, the incident visibly demonstrated that Norwegian neutrality could be overridden by a determined belligerent power without serious consequence. Germany used the episode in its own propaganda broadcasts to argue that Britain had no respect for neutral rights, and historians have generally agreed the Altmark incident measurably accelerated Adolf Hitler's own planning for the invasion of Norway, which followed roughly 2 months later in April 1940, partly justified in German propaganda as necessary to prevent further British violations of Scandinavian neutrality. In other words, the very rescue that made Britain look heroic to its own public also helped provide Germany the pretext it wanted for an invasion it was already planning for entirely different strategic reasons: control of Norwegian ports and the iron ore traffic running through them. Nothing about HMS Cossack's specifications made this story possible. She carried no special equipment for the job, no advantage in firepower over anything else in the home fleet, nothing that separated her from dozens of other tribal-class destroyers doing routine patrol work along the Norwegian coast that same week. What made the difference was a decision made in London to treat 299 individual human lives as worth the very real risk of a serious international incident, and a captain willing to carry that decision out to the letter, right down to boarding an enemy ship the old-fashioned way when there was no cleaner alternative left on the table. The law said Altmark was untouchable. 20 minutes of fighting in the dark, and 4 shouted words down into an oil tank said otherwise.